In 1914, in a village called Klarov, in what was then the Russian partition of Poland, a 12-year-old boy watched soldiers die. Not on a screen, not in a report. He walked among them, on the ground, after the battle had passed through his village like weather. And what he noticed, what stayed with him for the rest of his life, was not the violence itself, but the faces. Some of them were frozen in terror, some in agony, and some were calm, peaceful even, as though whatever had happened to them at the end had resolved something that being alive had not. The boy's name was Kazimierz Dąbrowski. He would grow up to become a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a man arrested by the Gestapo during the Second World War, and later persecuted by the Soviet-backed government of his own country. He would spend decades working with suicidal adolescents, with people whose minds were coming apart from the inside, with individuals who experienced the world at an intensity that most psychological frameworks could only describe as pathological. And from all of that, from the battlefield at 12, from the clinical work, from surviving the collapse of European civilization twice over, he would develop a theory that said something so counterintuitive that the psychiatric establishment of his era refused to take it seriously. He said that falling apart might be the point. Not always, not for everyone, and not in a way that anyone should find comforting. But for some people, under certain conditions, the disintegration of a functioning personality might be the only route to a real one. He called it positive disintegration. To understand what Dąbrowski meant, you have to understand what he was arguing against. Mid-20th century psychiatry operated on a simple premise. Integration is good, disintegration is bad. A well-adjusted person is a healthy person. If you fit in, if your inner life runs smoothly, if you don't cause problems for yourself or others, then you're psychologically sound. Anxiety, depression, inner turmoil, obsessive self-questioning, these are symptoms. Treat the symptoms, restore the adjustment, move on. Dąbrowski looked at that model and saw something it couldn't account for. He saw people who were perfectly adjusted and completely empty. And he saw people who were falling apart and becoming, through the falling apart, more aware, more morally alert, more themselves than they had ever been when they were holding it together. The well-adjusted person and the disintegrating person were not on the same scale. They were on different scales entirely. And the one most psychiatrists would have called sick was, in some cases, the one who was most alive. This was not a popular position. He published his first major work, Positive Disintegration, in 1964. In it, he laid out a framework that described 5 levels of personality development. But the word levels is misleading if it makes you think of a staircase, because most people never leave the first level, and the theory does not pretend otherwise. Level 1 he called primary integration. This is the default. Identity at this level is assembled from whatever is available: biological instinct, social expectation, cultural inheritance, the accumulated momentum of never having been seriously questioned. There is no inner conflict at level 1 because there is no inner hierarchy, no felt sense that some values or impulses are higher and others lower. The person functions, the person conforms. The person may be kind, productive, even admirable, but the personality has not been tested against itself. It runs on fuel it never chose and travels roads it never examined. Dąbrowski did not consider this a moral failure. He considered it the human default. And he observed that the vast majority of people, by his estimate around 65%, would live and die here without ever experiencing what comes next. What comes next is level 2, Unilevel disintegration, and it is, in Dąbrowski's own assessment, the most dangerous point in the entire framework. Something cracks. The old arrangement stops working. But the crack does not come with instructions. The person enters a crisis in which every alternative looks equivalent. Left or right, stay or go, this identity or that one, it all sits at the same altitude. There is no felt sense of higher or lower, no internal compass pointing towards something better, just horizontal movement between options that all taste the same. This is the crisis that self-help cannot address, because self-help presupposes that the person knows what better means and just needs help getting there. At level 2, better has no referent. There is just the floor, and the floor is moving. Dąbrowski was direct about what happens here. People get stuck at level 2 for decades. People die at level 2. He was not speaking metaphorically. His doctoral research was on the psychology of suicide. He knew what it looked like when a mind came apart with nowhere to go. But sometimes, and this is the turn on which the entire theory pivots, the crisis acquires a vertical dimension. The person begins to perceive difference within themselves, not imposed from outside, felt. A recognition that some of what they are is closer to what they could be, and some of it is further away. And the distance between those two things hurts in a way that cannot be ignored or medicated into silence. This is level 3, spontaneous multi-level disintegration. And the mechanism driving it is not insight, It is not therapy, it is pain. The pain of seeing yourself with a clarity you cannot revoke. Dąbrowski gave the forces operating at this level names that sound clinical but describe something more like weather systems moving through the psyche. Astonishment with oneself, disquietude with oneself, dissatisfaction with oneself, shame and guilt that belong not to any single act but to the whole shape of a life that was lived without examination. These are not symptoms to be treated. In Dąbrowski's framework, they are the developmental mechanism itself. The personality is beginning to sort itself into higher and lower, and the sorting is as violent as it sounds. Level 4, organized multi-level disintegration, is where the process becomes deliberate. The person is no longer passively experiencing the inner hierarchy but actively building within it, choosing what to keep and what to shed, constructing a personality based on an internal standard Dąbrowski called the personality ideal. This is still disintegration. The name is misleading if it suggests arrival. It means ongoing construction on unstable ground. And level 5, secondary integration, is the theoretical endpoint. A new personality, built from whatever survived the demolition. Dąbrowski pointed to figures like Gandhi and Doug Hammarskjöld as possible examples, then hedged. His own writing suggests he wasn't fully convinced it was achievable in any complete sense. It may function more as a coordinate than a destination, the point on the horizon that gives the process its direction, something you move toward, not something you reach. Now here is where Dąbrowski's theory asks something uncomfortable of anyone who encounters it. Because the obvious question is, why do some people disintegrate and others don't? And his answer does not flatter. He called it developmental potential, a combination of 3 factors. The first is constitutional. It includes what Dąbrowski termed overexcitabilities, an innate, heightened responsiveness to experience. Emotional overexcitability is not sensitivity in the polite sense. It is a depth of feeling that makes ordinary life arrive at an intensity most people never register. Intellectual overexcitability is not cleverness. It is the inability to stop questioning, to leave a thought alone, to accept an answer that satisfies everyone else. Imaginational overexcitability is a mind that keeps building worlds it was never asked to build. These are not gifts. They are the equipment for a particular kind of falling apart. The second factor is environmental. Dąbrowski acknowledged its role but gave it less weight than most psychologists would. You cannot engineer personality development from outside. The best an environment can do is not crush it. And the third factor is the strangest. Dąbrowski called it, with a plainness that either reflects humility or a complete indifference to marketing, the third factor. It is an autonomous internal force that drives the person toward their own development, not instinct, not conditioning, something that arises from within and refuses the current arrangement of the self. Where does it come from? Dąbrowski could not fully explain it. He could only observe that some people had it and some did not, and that having it was the difference between a crisis that destroys and a crisis that reorganizes. Now, if you have encountered Dąbrowski's theory before, chances are you encountered a version of it that told you something like this. Your suffering is meaningful. Your crisis is development. Your falling apart is the first step toward a higher you, and there is enough truth in that to be dangerous. Because Dąbrowski was not saying your disintegration will be positive. He was saying it can be. He was not saying everyone has the developmental potential to move through crisis. He was saying some people do, and his estimate of some was roughly 35% of the population. The remaining 65%, by his calculation, would live and die at level 1, not because they failed, because they are constituted differently. And even among those who begin to disintegrate, the outcome is not guaranteed. Dąbrowski titled one of his later books, Psychoneurosis is Not an Illness. It was a clinical provocation, a practicing psychiatrist arguing that the anxiety and depression his colleagues were trying to eliminate might be signs of a mind attempting to develop. But he was not naive about what that development costs. He had watched it fail. He had watched people fall and not reassemble. The theory holds both outcomes and refuses to choose between them. Any version that only shows you the hopeful side is not explaining Dąbrowski. It is packaging him for an audience that wants to hear that their suffering has a purpose. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. Dąbrowski did not make that promise. He made a harder, colder, more honest observation that the structures most people use to hold a self together are not the self, that those structures can shatter, that the shattering sometimes produces something more real than what existed before, and that sometimes it just produces wreckage. He built this theory in a country that kept being destroyed by larger powers. He was arrested, persecuted, uprooted. He watched the social and psychological infrastructure of his world disappear more than once. And each time he noticed the same thing. The human response was not uniform. Some people collapsed and stayed collapsed. Some people collapsed and in time became something their former selves could not have produced. The difference was not optimism. It was not willpower. It was something structural, something constitutional, something that could be described but not prescribed. Dąbrowski died in 1980. The theory never achieved mainstream acceptance. It found a home in the gifted education community, where the concept of overexcitabilities was used to explain why certain children experience the world at an intensity their environments cannot accommodate. But the larger framework, the radical claim that psychological suffering might be developmental rather than pathological, that a well-adjusted person might be the least developed person in the room, that most people will never experience the kind of crisis that leads to a real personality because they were never equipped for it, that remained too uncomfortable for most of psychology to absorb. It still is. And maybe the reason it's still uncomfortable is the same reason that 12-year-old boy on the battlefield couldn't stop looking at the faces. Because some of them were in agony, and some of them were at peace. And the difference was not about what had happened to them. It was about what they had become before it did. Dąbrowski spent the rest of his life trying to understand that difference. He did not resolve it. He described it as honestly as a man can describe something that refuses to be made safe. And he left the question where it belongs, not answered, just asked, with enough precision to make it impossible to forget.